James Sallee is a professor in the Economics Analysis and Policy Group at the Haas School of Business, as well as the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the Rosset College of Natural Resources. He teaches and studies topics related to energy, the environment, and the climate. I had the pleasure to talk to him about the International Maritime Organization's ideas for a net zero framework and the lessons for aviation. Let's get right into it. Let me ask you, first question, I wonder, how did you develop the interest in the maritime industry?
My only interest in the maritime industry is the extent that I care about carbon emissions from transportation more generally, and it's an important piece of the puzzle. And what piqued my interest to learn what I do know was the fact that they had talked about this really impressive carbon policy that I think is really unique in that it was purported to be, or was planned to be, a truly global carbon price. And on the surface, when I first looked at it, it sounded like the economist's dream finally come true, at least in one sector, which was a global aggressive price on carbon in one key sector. And that's what piqued my interest for sure.
So, and then you looked at it, and so how would you describe this system? Why did you think this is so why was it, did it seem so interesting to you?
Well, you don't see, so the policy that was passed last April was reported on and called either $100 a ton, a global price, or a $380 per ton global price that an industry had voluntarily supported. These were nations that within the IMO who are represented voting on this, but that a diverse group of nations and with this tacit or even more support of industry. That's eye-popping. How do you get that sort of agreement to impose numbers of that sort of level? That's incredibly interesting. Of course, once you start to scratch below those headline numbers, which I think are still quite substantial. I mean, the idea that they were flirting with this, very close to passing it, and may still revive it, is an impressive thing for sure, given the level and the global nature of the policy. But as an economist, once I started to learn the nature of the policy, realized that it wasn't a true carbon price and had some design features that were puzzling. And I'm trying to still decide to what extent are they puzzling versus problematic. I think there's a risk that they're problematic, but it was certainly curious once you scratched below the surface and started to understand that it wasn't just
explain
a carbon price.
Why do you think, because we are economists, right? So
yes,
why are economic or market mechanisms useful? Why do you want to have that? I think a lot of people, it's for someone with not having an economic training. This is not. I don't think it's so straightforward. Why do we want that? What's the point?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So let me say a couple things. Let's start with just why do we do economists like this? So there are a few things that garner more agreement among economists than the idea that if there are externalities out there in the world, so these are types of pollution or other things that the buyer and seller of a good don't pay for, and it's some burden that's being borne by a third party who's not represented in the transactions for some commodity, that it's appropriate to tax that, to put a price on it because the market transaction is missing that price. And economists understand and basically universally agree that the way to do that is to try to calculate kind of the size of those hidden costs that aren't being recognized by the market, and then realize them by putting a price on it. Economists universally agree on this, and non-economists universally dislike this implementation.
But there is also the other possibility of implementing standards. And this is also very common. So why would you want to have a price rather than like saying, okay, you have to become greener, right?
Yep, absolutely. So economists love putting a price on emissions or on pollution, whatever the case may be, the externality, because it is the cost-effective way to encourage market participants to reduce pollution. Okay, so it is a way, as a very robust finding in economic theory, that if you want to take pollution from some certain level and you want to lower it to another level, the lowest cost way to do that is to put a universal price that everybody faces commonly. You can use some other sets of standards. You could impose rules on every single actor and achieve the exact same efficiency if the person designing those policies was omniscient and knew everything that the entire market knows. So if a regulator was a benevolent, godlike entity who knew everything about the shipping industry, they could tell every single boat, every single vessel, how to reroute, what fuel to use, how fast to go, what investments to make in research and development. And they could prescribe that in great detail and get a cost-effective outcome. Alternatively, economic theory shows us that if you just put one common delineated price and everybody in the market faces that same incentive, then all of the private information that they have will lead them to make the decisions that make sense for them. Collectively, that turns out to achieve pollution reduction at the absolute lowest possible cost. Now, that doesn't have to ensure equity or fairness, but it ensures cost minimization across a fairly robust set of market conditions. And that's what economists love about market-based mechanisms.
And I think one thing that is important is that with these like market-based mechanisms, what you ensure is that those people who have very high cost of abatement, or those individuals, companies, whatever, with very high cost of abatement do not abate. Whereas those who have the low cost of abatement will abate. I think this is something that is very important to understand. It basically is what you said, but in a phrase a little bit differently. I think it doesn't mean that everybody should be abating, and this is basically what very often you do with standards, right? You also mentioned the equity, fairness. Sort of, you're saying, oh, everybody has to do something, but from an economics perspective, this is not efficient, right? And that's not really what we want. Would you, do you agree?
Absolutely. And another way to the flip side of the exact same thing you just said, which is exactly correct, is that when people have, we're using this term abatement, which is the economist language for I have a way to reduce pollution, right? The flip side of that is, well, if I don't have a way to reduce my pollution, then I have a really high willingness to pay to pollute. And so when you use a market-based mechanism, you give everybody an option. If it's really worth it to you to keep polluting because it's really lucrative for you to continue to sell the products that you're selling and you don't have any way to reduce your pollution, then the market-based mechanism allows that and says, okay, if you really want to pay $380 a ton to keep taking this particular ocean liner on this particular route, if it's really worth it to you, then go ahead and do it. But you're going to have to pay us $380 per ton of emissions. And anybody who has ways of lowering their emissions that cost less than $380 a ton or $100 a ton in the IMO framework that was proposed would then have an incentive to do that. And the beauty of market-based mechanisms is that there might be lots of ways that the industry and market actors can think of to lower their emissions that the regulators didn't think of and didn't know about and couldn't have prescribed. And so when you give them that incentive by facing them with the price to keep polluting, you give them the option, the freedom to keep polluting if that's the best thing to do, if it's worth it to them. And you give them the freedom to come up with all of the different ways that they could abate and reduce their pollution. And so that's what economists love about it. And those are the reasons why the market-based mechanisms tend to be substantially more cost-effective than standards-based alternatives, which, as you noted, are far more common. So we do have lots of examples of market-based mechanisms, and we could talk about exactly how to clarify the IMO policy. I'm sure we'll get to that.
I think we should get, because this is like natural now. The next step, because this is what you described, right? Is there's one price, but that's not what the IMO has prices, right? So perhaps you can just clarify.
When I first read media coverage before learning the details of the IMO policy, it was headlined as the IMOs had voted in last April to put a price on shipping emissions per ton of $100 or $380. I was like, well, so the first thing was like, why are there two different numbers that are quite different from each other, both of which are high and substantial and ambitious policies? But it turns out that there's two very different zones. So I'm going to describe that in a second. But the other thing that once you dig in past the headline is it turns out it's not a tax on emissions. It's actually an emissions intensity standard, where the way that this tax is calculated is based on meeting a target for greenhouse gas fuel intensity, which is emissions divided by energy consumed. And so it's not actually a tax on emissions, it's a tax related to emissions intensity, which turns out to matter quite a bit as well. So those are the two ways it's different. It's different because it has these different price bands, and I'll explain how they work next, and because it's an intensity standard, and it's going to turn out that matters a great deal probably as well. So the way that the policy was designed is it has a minimum standard that you have to meet, and then it has a more ambitious standard that it wants you to target. And so there's two dividing lines or two thresholds, and those move over time. But within a given year, there's just two thresholds, and those are based on this intensity metric of how much you emit in terms of CO2 equivalent per megajoule of energy expended. And then with these two lines, you're dividing the fleet into three cases. So there's people that are below the minimum line. So these are the really polluting guys, and we're going to put them in kind of a red zone. And then we've got the in between, and they're going to be in a yellow zone. And then we've got the people that have beaten the ambitious standard. So they're really clean vessels, and they're going to be in the green zone. So if you're in the green zone, there's no tax on you. And you are eligible for some subsidies. If they raise revenue through this program, then it even give you some subsidies. But you're also part of a cap and trade system that only involves the red and the green part, but not the yellow in the middle. So the yellow in the middle face a straight tax of $100 a ton. But then once you go over that threshold, it's like taking a big jump in your marginal tax rate in the income tax, where you're paying 10% on your income, and then you cross some threshold, and then suddenly the next dollar you pay, you might pay an 18% tax on that next dollar earned. So that's what happens at this next threshold. There's a big jump in the marginal cost of emissions, and it's either at $380 a ton, or if there are folks that were in the green market and are really clean, they could sell you permits, possibly for in equilibrium less than $380. And so we have this weird
and
Frankenstein
it
policy,
zero, right? I think this is sort of
the
range is now
zero.
between 0 and 380, right? The 100 basically is not. There is no reason for it to be 100, but it could be less.
I have never,
but not more than 380.
Exactly. I have never seen a policy that has this structure in any other domain that I can think. I've never seen anything like it before. And so in the yellow band,
may I just? I'm sorry for interrupting, but I think there is a reason for this. And the reason is that they earn. This is where the organization earns money. Right.
Yes.
I think this is something that is important to highlight. There's a rationale but there are some economic implications, and those are the ones that you are highlighting right now, and is related to what we discussed before. And this is the efficiency, the incentives, to make those guys with high abatement costs not abate, and those where guys with low abatement costs abate. So I think this is important to understand. So what we are talking right now is, okay, what are the economic consequences for the incentives to abate in an efficient way?
Yep, we've got an explanation as to how the policy came about, and we're now exploring the consequences of it. And so I don't know how much time you want to spend on each of those, but for someone who's not familiar with this, it is a bit odd. So they've got to understand the basics before we can dive in, because it is strange. It took me a couple of a couple of cycles to really understand what they had set up in the first place. So we should make sure we've nailed that, I suppose.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So again, this is just to say it again. If you are in this zone between the two thresholds, there's just a $100 per ton tax, and there's no trading market. And for every piece, every emission, unit of your emissions in that zone, you pay the IMO, and the IMO collects that revenue, and then, among other things, they're going to take some of that revenue and they were going to use it to subsidize the really clean vessels through some different programs. They were also had ideas about using some of that money to compensate island nations that are being harmed by climate change and otherwise to have some revenue. And so the reason that banned, this is based on reporting, not anything that I know independent of what was reported in the media. But apparently before the April vote last year, there were competing schools on what they wanted to do. And one side was really wanted to make sure they got this revenue, and another side was less interested. And they just sort of said the compromises will do both. But doing both creates some really strange economics. So the side that wanted to say we definitely want to be guaranteed we're collecting some revenue because we want to do stuff with that revenue, got their straight up tax. There's no option. It's a $100. It's not gonna nothing you can do. You can abate, but otherwise you're gonna pay that tax. But then once you jump over that threshold into the really dirty zone, if you're a vessel that's emitting more than that maximum target, then you still have to pay the tax on that first bit. So it's just like in your income. If you're, the marginal tax rate something for a while, you're paying on that. But when you jump to the next one, now you're either paying $300 a ton if there's no permit trading available. But instead of there just being a straight tax, there's now an option to achieve compliance by buying excess credits from the really clean vessels who are operating in the green. So the reason that this creates some really strange incentives is not just that we jump from 100 to 380. And in the marginal tax rate example, we have an increasing tax bracket because we're trying to tax rich people more. But here, the whole idea of a market-based mechanism is what we talked about before, which is we want to give everybody the exact same incentive for every decision so that everybody says, well, do I want to do this or do I want to do that? Well, I'm going to do this if it's less than $100 a ton to abate. But here, now we have the same vessels. If they're a little bit dirtier, instead of stopping at $100 a ton, would go all the way up to $380 a ton or some other price. There's no reason from an efficiency point of view to have these two different prices. It's a very strange structure. And so we don't normally see that in pollution markets either, where there's these multiple tiers, because the whole point of having a market-based mechanism is to harmonize everybody's decision making. So we harvest the low hanging fruit. That's always the metaphor I like to use. Is if abatement is the fruit and the high fruit is really hard to get to. The whole idea of market based mechanisms is the regulator doesn't know where all the low hanging fruit is, but if they can just draw a line and say, here's the price of pollution, everybody will use their private information about where all the opportunities are to harvest all of the low-hanging fruit. They'll do all of the inexpensive abatement. But now we've got some set of the market that's going to be doing that at $100 a ton as a cap and some at $380 a ton as a cap. And that's just inefficient. Okay, so that's that difference in rates is one possible inefficiency. I think what you were alluding to earlier, though, is we don't know that it's going to be $380 a ton, though. Because suppose that we have widespread adoption of one of the clean fuel switching technologies, like methanol really takes off in certain part of the fleet. There'll be a bunch of vessels in the green that are below the ambitious target, and they generate excess credits. They can then, instead of the red vessels having to buy or pay the $380 to the IMO, instead they could buy excess compliance credits. Just like any other cap and trade program, which people might be familiar with in lots of other markets around the world, and then and trade at that level. So we might not be at the $380 a ton ceiling. If some technology really takes off, that price could come down. But that price, in theory, could go all the way to zero. There's nothing stopping that, as far as I can understand from the policy write-ups, that would stop that. So we could get to some scenarios, not this year or next year, but in some future state where there's an abundance of credits and those prices actually fall below 100 all the way to zero, creating a really strange set of marginal incentives across the fleet that I think for sure nobody had intended.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about this, because I think this is so interesting, and I can really. I was reading your online note or article or however you want to call it, and I can imagine that for you, you just mentioned that it took you a while to get into. To develop some understanding about how this pricing system. What are the potential problems with this? And for me, reading your article made it easy to sort of to develop an understanding about this. And I also distributed my classes, actually. So that was, I think, really helpful. So thank you very much for this.
Great.
And I think this is also why we're having this discussion right now, because I think it makes a lot of sense to just so that you can sort of share your insights with others in this interview.
Yeah. So what this is going to do is it's going to create what you might call like a donut structure. So anybody operating this middle band has an incentive to reduce their emissions anytime they can do it at less than $100 a ton. Right. And if that means route optimization, if that means some fuel switching, if that means changing speeds, all of those things, they're going to be thinking, okay, this is worth $100 a ton to me. But folks who are in the green or the red are either facing a $380 cap, right? So if there's very few really clean, there's very few green ammonia vessels out there, there's very little methanol that would get you into this green zone, then folks that are in the green or in the red will be facing a really high $380 a ton. Okay, but in the opposite version, we could get to the opposite extreme where the price falls all the way to zero. So if there's widespread adoption of one of these clean fuels that gets lots of the fleet down into the green zone, then folks that are vessels that are in the red zone are going to face a zero marginal price for their emissions. So the only way they can, because if there were so many excess credits. So why might this happen? Well, it might happen if a bunch of the world's fleet actually decarbonizes like we hope and does a big fuel switch, and we unlock some of the supply bottlenecks around one of the clean fuels, which of course is the IMO's goal. The goal is to get there. Then what that's going to mean is there's lots of fleets operating in the green. And that could very well drive the price down for these dirtiest producers. Now, what's that going to mean? So just to be clear, if you're a really dirty vessel in this world, you're still paying a tax of $100 for those emissions that are in the yellow zone. But if you're far from that threshold, there's no incentive to reduce your emissions at all, unless you can get all the way down to get into the lower tax bracket, if you will. And so in this donut structure, if the policy succeeds in getting widespread adoption of the new technology, in some sense, that's going to breed this inefficiency and really counterintuitive result, which is that if we get a whole bunch of adoption of fuel switching, then it's going to drive the price down in the red and the green trading zones. And then vessels that are really heavily polluting, if they know that nothing they can do with that vessel is going to get them to reduce their emissions all the way to the point where they'd be in that yellow zone, then they just have no incentive to abate at all. They just buy the abundant compliance credits at the price of zero and go about their day. And people might say, well, what's the probability that this policy gets down to zero? I would flag lots of cap and trade markets trade at their price floor on a regular basis. This is a regular feature of cap and trade markets. California, for example, has one of the world's not the largest in the EU, but has one of the most significant cap and trade programs that's been running for a couple of decades. And through most of that time, the California cap and trade market traded at a regulatory price floor. So it wasn't zero, but it was a very low number that had been legislated that if prices fell to this level, as far as I can understand, there's no price floor in the IMO's policy. I think they're not anticipating a world where there's abundant credits, but of course, it's hard to anticipate how the market might move. And I would just flag that it has been a regular feature of cap and trade markets that they've hit ceilings and floors that are built into them. And there's been some good research arguing that in lots of cases, there's so much volatility in these cap and trade markets that we should expect that ex ante, that it's a pretty normal thing for these kinds of policies to end up trading at these high or low prices. And as a result, I think we should take seriously right now the possibility that you could end up in these sort of perverse, unexpected outcomes where you might get very weird incentives that I'm quite certain nobody intended. But as an outcome, again, as you noted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the EU ETS, also, people were saying, in the very beginning, the prices were pretty low. They're not so low anymore, but they have been pretty low. And then people were saying, they're almost, we don't know whether it really does something because of the permit prices are so low.
In the EU, the first phase of the EU ETS, all the countries got their national allocations of permits through this bottoms up process. And the result was after a couple of years, people were trading. There were billions of dollars in this market. It was a liquid market. It was working. And then there was an intermediate compliance period where every nation started to report how they were doing relative to their target. And lo and behold, everyone came in low. Everyone's like, our emissions are lower than expected. And partly what had happened is they were asking for allocations, and the allocations were free, and they just had to say, our emissions are going to be really high. And so Brussels sent out big allocations to everybody, and on average everybody asked for more than they needed. And once the market realized that, then they said, there's so many permits out there. We have more permits than we actually had pollution. And when that happens, then the price goes to zero. And so the price literally went all the way to zero in the EU ETS, and lots of wealth was wiped out from people who thought they were holding permits that were going to be valuable. It's been increasingly stable since then, but the market started off with that result. And so I do want to, again, really big markets with very sophisticated traders and covering and very thoughtful policy designers are subject to these kinds of results. And so I think if I were designing the IMO's policy, I would take that seriously as a possibility.
And I think that this clearly depends on the intensity standards. So if they are too generous, yes, I think that's what you just described, the effect that there will be, basically the market will be flooded by permits that are provided by clean ships. This is a much more likely scenario. But I think for us, that may be a little difficult to assess whether the intensity standards are actually generous or ambitious or what they are. I think for us, this is a little difficult to tell. This is something the engineers should be trying to figure out properly.
I am not going to pretend to have an opinion as to whether there's a real chance that enough of the fleet would be below that number. I would just call out that, the sort of the net zero vision of the IMO is to create a wholesale move away from vessels that use some form of bunker fuel and petroleum and move to a vehicle that in its life cycle analysis of carbon emissions is deemed to be really clean. And if they get real market momentum in that way, what you'll end up with is a bunch of clean vessels that would be below the standard. And you're probably going to get a whole bunch of laggards who have really old, inefficient vessels who don't want to retire them. And that's exactly the set of vessels who would end up in that red zone, who could be given no incentive on the margin to do operational efficiency. And I think the thing to really flag for why having these different price points and stuff really matters is the thing we really want the industry to do. And I think the way that the people who are thinking about a net zero transition and wholesale market change are thinking, we just need to create a big prize for getting to, fuel switch and getting all the way away from bunker fuel into, green ammonia or some technology that we prove out and in the market and can scale. But there's a lot of carbon to be reduced in the meantime through operational efficiency. And in fact, prior things that the IMO has done to try to encourage efficiency seem to have been quite impactful. And again, here I'm not an engineer, so if I get this a little bit wrong, I don't need an email about it. But there is a big translation between speed and fuel consumed when passing through water, right? So a 10% drop in speed is going to create a really substantial improvement. So changes in operational
efficiency. Something important to highlight is, and again, I mean, I'm also not I don't operate a shipping line. I'm an economist like you are, but my understanding is that fuel costs are very substantial for shipping lines. And it's even around 50% or perhaps even more than 50%. So that's when we're talking about fuel. And of course, we're talking about fossil fuel and then carbon emissions. Clearly, this is a very important cost component for shipping lines. So and this is where these like slow steaming ideas and these kind of practices become so important. Yeah.
Yeah, and we know the industry is responsive to this. We see when fuel prices rise, we see ship speeds change, and then so one view of that is like so a non-economist might see that and say, oh well, then they're already doing that. Why do you need a policy? Why am I complaining about that? Well, I would say they're not doing that as much as they should, because part of the fuel cost, a substantial part of the fuel cost is the pollution, and that part they're ignoring because they don't currently have to pay for that.
Right? Yeah.
Right. And so what we would like them to be doing is we'd like them to be doing even more slow steaming. We'd like them to be doing even more route optimization, thinking even more about their fill rates. Right. We got a lot of ocean liners going crossing the Pacific full one way and empty the other way. It's not an easy problem to solve. There's an imbalance of the way that global goods are moved. But this is the exact kind of thing. It's like, why an economist says, well, I don't know how to solve that problem. I don't know how to operate an ocean liner. I don't know how to fix this industry. But the market probably has ideas I haven't thought of. And I want to make sure that they are incentivized to figure them out. And when I give them a carbon price, they do that. But if I give them these really weird incentives where some of them have a 4 times bigger incentive than other vessels, then I know I'm not getting the lowest cost possible to get a reduction in total pollution that affects the whole planet. Instead, I'm getting a hodgepodge of some people spending a lot of money and some people spending far less. And then again, if I've got some clean vehicles in the green, they might be spending nothing, right? Like depending on the equilibrium price of the permit market. And so I don't want this mishmash of different people facing different incentives, because there's a lot of this operational stuff that matters and really does move the needle on how much the current fleet, which is going to be in operation for a long time. These vessels don't come and go.
That's right.
They are very long lived.
It's hard to abate. This is why people call it like a hard to abate sector.
Yes.
Because you just have those vessels and they have a long lifetime. The engines have a long lifetime and they are expensive. So it's simply not economic or efficient to replace them too early, because they have been important investments. And I think this is one of the features that I think we will get back to this a little later. But let me, because in your online note, what you're doing is now we have been focusing on the scenario in which basically there are lots of clean vessels. There's also the other extreme scenario, which you describe in your online note. But I think from our discussion until now, it's already clear how these different price signals, cause some problems. So I think for those people who are interested in the other extreme scenario, maybe I will provide a link in the description down below, because you highlight another issue. And this is, I feel, another very important part, and this is the intensity standard. So how do you define the thresholds? And it's not, this is something really another very interesting and important part to understand, shortcoming, I would say, of that policy. And if you could just, share with us how you think about that.
So all of these estimates of how much carbon you've emitted are translated off of a metric, which is the actual target threshold of the policy, which is a greenhouse gas fuel intensity. So it's grams of CO2 equivalent that come from your operations divided by energy consumed. Okay. And so there's a numerator, which is how much pollution you have, and there's a denominator, which is how much energy you consumed while driving around. And this is quite different in its incentive structure than what we're trying to do is tax the numerator. So why do we have a denominator at all? Is the question. Because and the consequence of having the denominator is, imagine that take slow steaming as my key example here. So slow steaming, I'm going to slow my speed down. That's going to change how much I'm emitting. It's also going to change how much energy I'm using. So if I'm using the same feedstock on my, I'm using the same bunker fuel in my vessel, to a first order approximation, when I slow down, my energy consumed and my pollution are going to move together. Right. And so that metric, I may not be able to get any credit against the intensity metric by doing things like slow steaming at all, which we know are huge opportunities for abatement in this market. And because what I'm doing is I'm not being rated on just how much pollution I had. Instead, I'm being rated on how much pollution I had relative to how much energy I consumed. So that's really a metric that makes sense if my goal is to get you to do the big thing of fuel switching, of going from a vessel that is operating on a petroleum product versus one that is trying to use something that's some sort of green methanol or ammonia. And if imagine a different denominator could have been like ton-mile shipped. So it could have been a measure of like how much stuff did I move, how far, and then it would be a different question, right? It would be like, well, if I went from destination source A, I went from one destination to an origin, and I moved this many tons of stuff, I want to divide my carbon by that. Then if I slow steamed, and I got to my port with having used less carbon, then I wouldn't have lowered my denominator, but I would have lowered my numerator, so I would have gotten some credit. The concern is if you have a megajoules of energy consumed in your denominator, that you really can't see credit for operational efficiency gains at all. That might be the first order things that could be done in the near term to get some real gains from these pricing signals. So that is a big concern. There's also a concern that imagine that I am a clean vessel operating at an intensity standard that's below the requirement. The more I've traveled around, the more credits I get. So I might be tempted on the margin to extend my route to use more fuel because when I do that, I obviously have real fuel costs, so you'd have to balance those out. But if the credit is lucrative, $380 a ton in some of those scenarios, we're going to have these like clean fuel vessels running extra. And not just that they would do extra routes, but they might do unproductive extra travel just to generate credits. That would be a real disaster for the climate if that's what we incentivized.
And we also have examples for companies that really earn a lot from such I would not say such practices, but from being green. And I think a prime example for this is Tesla, right? In the very early days, I think they made a lot of their revenues came actually from California, from selling permits to others. So the reason why I'm mentioning this, although the system may be a little different. Although maybe not so different, because when we're talking about the low carbon fuel standards, right? But companies, we have examples which we can use to basically find some evidence for cases in which companies really earn a lot from green practices, and it can be almost their main business. So the orders of magnitude can be very substantial.
Yep, and and we can debate in different cases whether that was the intention of the policy or an unintended side effect. But it is again this harkening back to lessons we have from other policies and other domains where we have a long history to look at. Like I said before, we see lots of cases where these cap and trade markets trade at the ceiling or the floor. So these are not far-fetched ideas when you just look at cap and trade markets across the board. So this donut could have lots of different structures and create lots of different perverse incentives. And just what you said as well, which is that when you create these lucrative cap and trade systems where there's a compliance credit, there are some firms that might come into existence and really take advantage of that. And again, like I think the IMO would say, well, that's kind of what we want. Like we wanted, California wanted Tesla to take advantage of those credits, at least for some period of time, to help them get going. And the IMO might say, well, yeah, we want people to be able to really cash in if they can, bring more clean ammonia to the industry. But we definitely don't want them doing counterproductive things to squeeze more and more value out of that compliance market, which I think that the incentives they've created here create a real risk of that people should be taking seriously.
Yeah, I think there are two issues, right, that you highlighted. I think these are so important that, we should perhaps just highlight one more time. It's saying slow steaming is important, but given how the standards are defined, there are maybe no incentives to practice slow steaming. And that seems counterproductive. And the other issue is that even beyond that, not providing incentives for good greening practices, but rather even providing incentives to behave in a way that would lead to more emissions rather than lower emissions. So, and that seems that's part of that intensity standard. But there is also the solution, which you described as just change the denominator, or what you're also saying in the article is just look at the total emissions. So you have those origin destination, those distances, and just come up with a emission standard for certain connections, which is independent of whether someone makes a detour or not, right?
Yep. There's so many cases in other industries as well where policymakers resort to a standard because it's sort of intuitive and it makes sense. And again, I think here, this I'm speculating, but I think that when you're thinking we're trying to set this industry on a course for 2050, where we're going to turn over the entire fleet of vessels into running on some sort of new clean fuel, then all you're thinking about is like what's going to cause them to make a big fuel switch, make the big capital change, and get a new ship completely. But there's so many other ways that the policy incentives are going to create important incentives beyond that one margin of decision of what fuel source do I want my vessel to have. There's so many other decisions that make sense, and the policy as constructed, risks like perverting some of those other decisions, and in other cases, failing to incentivize low-cost abatement that really would be important for the planet. I mean, I think it would be phenomenal. I think we would see a meaningful reduction in emissions from shipping if they had a $100, much less a $380 a ton, that applied universally to all activities and could lead to changes in slow steaming and things like that. But the solution for the economist is just price the thing you want to price, not an intensity. You don't care about GFI, the metric, that intensity metric per se. You care about tons of pollution. And there are some reasons, there are some cases where intensity standards are justified, but I don't think any of them apply here. And so the really simple solution is that. But I think that even a different denominator, if you're committed to an intensity standard for some other reasons, then a different denominator might actually be a more appealing denominator, because it would not create some of these perverse incentives.
And I think something important, another important thing and a positive thing to highlight is that there is no requirement on how you achieve those lower intensity standards, because that's also quite common that policymakers will be telling you, oh, you should be doing this or you should be doing that, right? You give sort of have a strict environment, but here, basically what the policy says, and that's a good thing, is that however you achieve the standard, the thresholds become green. We don't care about that. And this is very important for the reasons that you have mentioned in the very beginning. This is that it's just, as a policymaker, you don't know what will be the future technologies that really will matter, right?
That's exactly right. And we've had kind of a negative tone, a critiquing tone of this policy, but I think it deserves praise for two reasons. One, or well, at least maybe I'll say three. One is, again, it's a really ambitious set of prices. Between $100 is itself an ambitious, impressive price given the context, and $380 certainly is an ambitious price. So I think it's an ambitious policy that has a long-sighted goal on like the need to turn over a market, and so that's something to be celebrated. Second is, again, this global nature is really appealing. This idea that we could, get that would be unique there. I don't think there's, we have global regulations for ozone that have been pretty successful, but when we look at the carbon space, I don't know that there's anything that we've really been able to land that has this kind of a global nature. In the aviation industry, we have something like Corsia. Right. But I would like to get back to this a little later in our discussion. But I just want to say the other thing is like it. Yeah, the other thing I just wanted to say is the third thing is that to go back to your original prompt for this, which it is really appealing. They did a good job of saying, well, we're going to create a metric and we're going to let you comply any way you want. And the greatest, kind of boost to the theory of market-based mechanisms that happened in the history of policy was the sulfur dioxide trading markets in the United States back in the 80s and early 90s. Where, the presumption before they, so this was to deal with acid rain problems, mainly from coal-fired power plants in the United States that emitted sulfur dioxide, were creating regional damages, really substantial. And the regulators thought, well, the main way that they should solve this problem is by installing these really expensive, like $1 billion scrubbers that just kind of like filter the air and try to take some of the particulates out from the smokestack. And that was what everybody thought would happen. But instead of mandating scrubbers, what they did initially was they created a trading program. And lo and behold, it turned out that the most cost-effective solution for most coal-fired power plants was to actually ship low sulfur coal from across the country to their facility and burn the low sulfur coal, and they could avoid installing the scrubbers. And so the policy succeeded at a much lower cost than anybody had anticipated. And what's interesting is part of the reason that worked and people hadn't expected it is that it coincided with changes in the railroad regulation industry that brought prices down. And so shipping the coal across the country turned out to be much cheaper than people had expected. And that just goes to show that's the kind of thing that even a really smart policymaker might not anticipate and see this chain of events. See, economists love putting out there an agnostic policy that says, I'm going to set you a goal. You figure out how to meet it. As long as I believe the metric I'm setting out, as long as the metric is right, you come up with whatever solution you come up with. And so I think that is a good feature
and
of
I think
the IMO's approach.
the other example is that's something that we had some interviews with Stephen Holland. He was highlighting that nobody predicted that electric vehicles would be the solution for reducing carbon emissions. And that was, the policy that have been implemented, these low carbon fuel standards, have been agnostic. They didn't tell you, there was just said, oh, you have to be clean. We don't care about how you become clean. And the solution, the market outcome has been quite, surprising and but very effective. And I think the reason why I want to highlight this is because I'm sorry. The reason why I want to highlight this is because in getting back to aviation, the policies are quite different because there are some substantial policy, I would say, constraints on how to achieve reductions in carbon emissions. And this is why I'm highlighting this, because it's not, we can't take it for granted, but there is a huge benefits. And you gave another example for why this leads to such, why being agnostic can be a big advantage.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. So I think that is a thing to be celebrated here. And as we've noted, there's things to improve, but there are some really, really important core characteristics that are great about this policy. And to be clear, I would have been excited if they had this had been fully implemented. I hope that some version of it gets implemented, but I also like to see it the economic efficiency improved for sure. But I think in these other domains where we've had less flexibility, it's been quite costly. The industry definitely does not know in this case exactly what technology is going to be the long run solution. Just like with cars, you said we didn't know about electric cars. There was a time not that long ago, I can remember, when we really thought hydrogen fuel cell cars for light duty transportation might head to head compete. And, very important companies like Toyota placed their bet in that direction. And one side of that won, and the electric vehicles won that. But we didn't know ex ante. We do not want to tie this industry to one fuel solution or say how much of the decarbonization solution should come from different pathways versus fuel switching versus other kinds of operational efficiencies and everything else. And so I don't think it's I think we want to remain agnostic, but being agnostic works well when the metric you're tied to is exactly the thing you really care about. And so we want to make sure, and I do think another concern on the metric is that I think we're not going to get into is, how they do the life cycle assessment of some of these alternative fuels can be a source of significant scientific debate because of complicated effects on land use and other things. And so that's true in any of these sectors. It's going to be true for aviation. The exact same problem is going to be first and foremost. So there's a lot of hard technical problems, and that's a genuinely hard one to solve. Some of the economic efficiency stuff could be fixed. It would be a doable. And so I hope that as people spend time working on this policy, that there's some room for conversation and improvement and protection against some perverse outcomes that could really damage political momentum if they occurred.
So I have before we finish the discussion, I mean, I have a lot of more things that I would like to be discussing with you, but I understand we already spent quite a lot of time on this. But let me highlight one other aspect, which I think is also extremely important, because when we talk about policies, we now talked about efficiency. But distribution is, of course, a very important part. So you create welfare. How do you allocate the welfare to the different people? And I think this has to do with implementation, the chance of being successful in implementing green policies. And as you highlighted in the very beginning, you said, oh, that was interesting that the IMO approach was actually, that we were on the way. I mean, we kind of now struggle, but it seemed to be on the good way. And I have a theory why that happens. And this is because there is a solution for the distribution, because there is abstracting away from the middle part of the donut. The clean ships pay the dirty ships pay the clean ships. So there is money earned from clean ships, and it comes from the dirty ships. So it stays within the industry, and this means that. This is very compelling, because the argument is, we have to pay something, and we don't know whether we're going to benefit from it or how we're going to benefit from it. But it's very clear that here the dirty ships pay the clean ships, and it's the same industry, and basically everyone has the same opportunity to become green, or that's at least, you could phrase it that way. And I think that makes it for the industry as a whole compelling and attractive. And I think this is why we have this. This is why we have, they seem to be relatively successful in convincing the industry to do something like that.
I agree. And I've been trying to convince the state of California, which has been forced by regulatory changes on the Trump administration to abandon the regulatory approach for decarbonizing the trucking, commercial trucks in the state, away from the method that they were deploying. And I've been trying to convince them to do something more along these lines, and arguing, hey, nobody wants, and this is a non-starter at the moment, especially with what's going on in the Middle East this month and last month. But they're very reluctant to say we'd put any sort of a tax on commercial shipping, because it creates inflation, raises prices of goods. But my argument is like, well, just take that money and recycle it to the other side of the shipping industry, keep it all within trucking, by having the money that the polluters are doing needs to just go to people who are adopting the clean trucks faster. And that doesn't solve all of these problems. It still raises costs because people are doing abatement activities they wouldn't do otherwise. But by keeping it within the industry, I think you might make a better sell on this political economy distributional points. And of course, for shipping and for trucking, there's large concentration of fleets among at least some operators. I think in the trucking industry, there's a longer tail of individual owner operators who are worried about how this would affect them. And so the political economy might be a little bit different, but I agree on your point and have tried to emphasize it elsewhere.
Yeah, I really think this is so important. When we think about green policies, efficiency is good, but we have to think about the distribution. This is so important, because this is finally, I think, what determines whether you will be successful in implementing. And here the IMO approach is, I think, another real good example. So, and I talked to some industry representatives, and they were saying, oh, we like that because we don't, it stays within the industry. Okay, you have some ships that are dirty and they pay, but that money doesn't go to the government. It stays within the industry. I feel this is so important, and it doesn't affect the incentives. Only improves the probability of having such a policy in place.